I can continue with an original version of the story, rather than closely copying the specific revenge cold stories format. I'm hanging up, my husband said. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. That was what made it hurt more. I'm not your emergency fund, Maya. Every time something goes wrong in your life, you expect me to fix it. I tightened my grip on the hospital corridor railing until my fingers turned white. My mother is being taken into surgery in 6 hours, I whispered. The hospital needs a $10,000 deposit before they begin. Silence. Then a quiet laugh. You know what your problem is. You're a burden, you've always been one. I felt the words land harder than any shout ever could. Don't call me again unless you're calling to sign the divorce papers. The line went dead. For several seconds, I kept the phone against my ear, listening to nothing. Around me, stretchers rolled past. Nurses called out patient numbers. Somewhere nearby, a little boy cried because he didn't want another injection. Life continued as though mine hadn't just fallen apart. I slowly lowered the phone and stared at the blank screen. My mother was pretending to sleep inside room 214. She knew exactly why I had stepped outside. She also knew I had run out of people to call. My mother, Evelyn Carter, had spent 34 years working as a public school librarian. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. But every former student who walked into that hospital recognized her. Mrs. Carter, one young doctor asked during rounds, you taught me how to love books. She smiled despite the pain. I only showed you where the shelves were. That was my mother. She believed kindness was something you practiced quietly. Unfortunately, kindness doesn't pay surgical bills. Her diagnosis had come suddenly. A damaged heart valve. Without surgery, her condition would worsen quickly. With surgery, her doctors estimated an excellent recovery. The problem wasn't medicine. It was money. Insurance covered most of the procedure, but not enough. The remaining balance was just over $10,000. To some people that was manageable. To me, it might as well have been 10 million. I wasn't unemployed. I worked hard. For 7 years, I had managed a small neighborhood bookstore that barely stayed profitable. I loved the work. I loved recommending novels to teenagers who thought they hated reading. I loved watching grandparents buy picture books for grandchildren they'd never stop spoiling. What I didn't love was my paycheck. After rent, groceries, my mother's medications, and old debts from my father's illness years earlier, I usually had less than $200 left each month. Savings weren't impossible. They were imaginary. People often ask why I married Daniel. The answer is simple. Because he wasn't always the man who hung up on me. When we first met, he admired my compassion. He said it made me different. After our wedding, he started calling it weakness. Then responsibility. Then baggage. Finally, burden. Funny how one person's greatest quality slowly becomes their greatest flaw in someone else's eyes. 3 days passed. I barely slept. The hospital granted one extension after another because the surgeon personally believed my mother deserved every chance. Friends collected what little they could. Former co-workers donated. Even strangers slipped envelopes into the hospital receptionist's hands after hearing about Mrs. Carter. Every contribution mattered. Every dollar reminded me that goodness still existed somewhere. But we were still thousands short. I stopped checking my phone. I couldn't bear another message asking whether I'd found the money. Because the answer never changed. No. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was sitting beside my mother's bed pretending to read. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You've always frowned at the same page when you're worried. I looked down. I hadn't turned the page in nearly 20 minutes. I'm sorry, I said. For what? For not being enough. She smiled. You sound just like your father. That surprised me. He used to apologize every time life became difficult, she continued. as though storms were personal failures. A nurse knocked gently before stepping inside. "Ms. Carter." "Yes, there's a phone call for you." I frowned. "My cell phone." "No, the front desk. They said it's important." I exchanged a confused look with my mother. "I'll be right back." The receptionist handed me the receiver. "I don't know who this is," she whispered, "but he insisted you answer immediately." I picked it up. "Hello." Heavy breathing answered first. Not frightened breathing. Exhausted. As though the man had run several flights of stairs. Finally he spoke. "Is this Maya Carter?" "Yes. Thank goodness." His voice shook. "I've been trying to find you since yesterday." "I'm sorry, who is this?" "My name is Victor Lang." The name meant nothing. "I think you've called the wrong person." "No." Another deep breath. "I've spent 3 days looking for the daughter of Evelyn Carter." My heart skipped. What does my mother have to do with this? There was another pause. When he finally answered, his voice was softer than before. "She saved my life 26 years ago." And for the first time in days, I felt hope return. 26 years. The number echoed in my mind, as though it belonged to someone else's story. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "I think you must be mistaken." "I wish I were," the man replied. "It would have saved me 3 days of searching." His breathing had settled, but I could still hear the strain beneath every word. "My assistant finally located this hospital less than 15 minutes ago. Please don't hang up." "I'm listening." "When I was 14, I lived in Cedar Falls. That caught my attention. So did my mother." "I know." His voice softened. "I was the kid everyone thought would end up in prison." I didn't interrupt. Some stories deserve silence before they deserve questions. "My father drank," Victor continued. "My mother worked 2 jobs until she became sick. By the time I started high school, I was skipping classes almost every week. I stole. I lied. I fought. I wasn't proud of it. I simply didn't know another way." He let out a slow breath. "One afternoon I wandered into the public library because it was warm. I closed my eyes. My mother had worked in that exact library for nearly 3 decades. I wasn't looking for books," he said. "I was looking for somewhere nobody would ask questions. I stayed until closing. Your mother walked over carrying a stack of books." I smiled despite everything. She always carried more books than anyone reasonably should. I expected her to tell me to leave. Instead, she asked, "Have you eaten today?" My throat tightened. That sounded exactly like her. I lied. I told her yes. She looked at me for about 5 seconds. Then she disappeared into the staff room. When she came back, she placed half of her dinner beside me. "No lecture. No pity. No speech. Return the container whenever you finish," she said. That was it. Victor chuckled quietly. I actually returned the container. Mostly because I wanted another meal. The laugh faded. She noticed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she'd somehow bring extra food. Never enough to embarrass me. Always enough that I stopped stealing from grocery stores. I leaned against the reception desk. None of this surprised me. My mother had always believed dignity mattered just as much as generosity. If someone needed help, she found a way to offer it without making them feel small. Eventually, Victor continued, she convinced me to read 1 book. I hated reading. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Finish 30 pages. If you still hate it, I'll never recommend another one." I found myself smiling. That sounded like one of her favorite challenges. So I read 30 pages. And then another 30. And another. The book wasn't really the point. What mattered was that for the first time, Someone expected something from me besides failure. What happened after that? I asked. I graduated. Not with amazing grades. But I graduated. I earned a scholarship to a trade program. Started repairing industrial equipment. Opened my own maintenance company at 27. Expanded into manufacturing. There was no pride in his voice. Only gratitude. Today our company employs just over 1,800 people. I blinked. 1,800. I've spent years speaking at schools about second chances. And every single speech begins with the same sentence. He paused. A librarian fed me before she educated me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked the obvious question. If my mother meant that much to you, why didn't you ever contact her? I tried. I visited the library after I sold my first company. They told me she'd retired. I left flowers. I donated books anonymously. I assumed she'd never know. His voice became quieter. 3 days ago, I was speaking at a literacy fundraiser. Someone mentioned a retired librarian named Evelyn Carter who needed emergency surgery. I asked for her address. They only knew she'd been admitted somewhere in the city. So you searched every hospital. Every single one. I felt something catch in my throat. You searched every hospital. I owed her my life. It didn't seem unreasonable. I looked through the glass toward my mother's room. She was pretending to read. Probably wondering why a simple phone call was taking so long. Victor spoke again. May I ask one question? Of course. How much is still needed? I hesitated. It isn't your responsibility. I know. But I asked anyway. I swallowed. $7,480. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, I heard papers moving. A keyboard. Someone speaking quietly in the background. Then, would you please walk downstairs to the hospital administration office? Why, my finance director is already there. I frowned. What? He happened to be visiting one of our suppliers nearby. I called him 15 minutes ago. I couldn't find the words. He'll settle the remaining balance directly with the hospital. No publicity. No press. No photographs. Your mother gave without witnesses. I'd like to do the same. I closed my eyes. For 3 days I had prepared myself for rejection every time the phone rang. Now I didn't know how to react to kindness this large. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Maya. His voice was gentle. Please don't take away the only opportunity I've ever had to repay the woman who changed my future. Tears finally escaped. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet tears that refused to stay inside. Okay. I whispered it. Okay. 20 minutes later, a woman in a navy business suit introduced herself to the hospital administrator. Everything was handled professionally. No negotiations. No delays. No conditions. When the paperwork was finished, the administrator approached me with a relieved smile. Mrs. Carter's surgery is officially cleared. Just like that. The sentence I'd been praying to hear for 3 days became real. When I returned to my mother's room, she looked up immediately. You've been crying. I laughed through the tears. A little. What happened? I pulled a chair beside her bed. Do you remember a 14-year-old boy who practically lived in the library? She looked thoughtful. There were several. This one used to return empty lunch containers. Her eyes widened. Victor, do you remember? I remember hungry children. She smiled sadly. I never forgot any of them. I took her hand. He never forgot you either. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes drifted toward the window before returning to mine. Victor Lang, she asked quietly. Yes. She leaned back against the pillow and let out a slow breath. I always wondered what became of him. You never knew. She shook her head. No. I hoped he finished school. I hoped he stayed away from the boys who were always getting into trouble. She smiled faintly. I prayed he would find one adult who believed in him. I laughed softly. You were that adult. She frowned. I only packed an extra sandwich. No, I said. You gave him something far more expensive. She looked at me with quiet confusion. What? The feeling that someone expected him to become more than his worst day. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. I don't remember doing anything extraordinary. That's because extraordinary people rarely notice when they're being extraordinary. The surgery was scheduled for early the next morning. That night, I stayed in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her bed. Every few hours, a nurse came in to check her vitals. Every few hours, I checked the clock. Neither of us slept much. Around midnight, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. For a second, I wondered if it was another billing department. Instead, it was Victor. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No, she's asleep. Good. There was a brief silence. I wanted to ask something. Go ahead. When she's feeling stronger. Would she allow me to visit? I don't know. She never liked people making a fuss over her. He laughed. That hasn't changed. No, not at all. I'll wait as long as necessary. The operation lasted 4 hours and 18 minutes. Those were the longest 4 hours of my life. Every time the operating room doors opened, every family in the waiting area stood at once. Some sat back down smiling. Others didn't. Time behaves strangely in hospitals. Minutes stretch. Hours disappear. Hope rises and falls with every pair of footsteps. Finally, the surgeon walked toward me. His surgical cap was still on. His mask hung around his neck. I couldn't read his expression. For one terrifying second, I imagined the worst. Then he smiled. The procedure went very well. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until my knees nearly gave out. There were no unexpected complications. She'll need time. But I expect a full recovery. I thanked him so many times that eventually he laughed. You've already said it enough. No, I replied. I haven't. Recovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind you see in movies. There wasn't a miraculous moment where she sat upright and announced she felt wonderful. There were difficult days. Physical therapy. Pain. Medication adjustments. Fatigue. Progress measured in tiny victories. Walking 6 steps. Then 12. Then the entire hallway. Celebrating ordinary things suddenly became natural. A week later, Victor finally came to visit. He arrived without security. Without expensive gifts. Without cameras. He carried only a small paper bag. When he stepped into the room, I noticed something unexpected. He looked nervous. Far more nervous than the day he'd called me. My mother looked up from her chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victor smiled. Hello, Mrs. Carter. She studied his face carefully. Older, more confident. Silver beginning to appear near his temples. But still unmistakably the same boy. Victor. His eyes filled immediately. You remembered. I remember everyone who checked out adventure novels but secretly preferred poetry. He laughed through tears. I can't believe you remembered that. You always returned the poetry books late. I read them twice. You did. He handed her the paper bag. I wasn't sure whether you'd like this. She opened it slowly. Inside was a worn plastic lunch container. The lid had faded over the years. One corner was slightly cracked. She stared at it in disbelief. "You kept it for 26 years. I plan to return it properly someday." She looked at him. "You already returned it." "I know, but not with the thanks it deserved." The room became completely silent. No dramatic speeches. No grand declarations. Just two people separated by decades, quietly recognizing the place they once held in each other's lives. "I brought something else." Victor reached into his jacket and unfolded a photograph. It showed nearly 2,000 employees standing in front of a large manufacturing facility. Across the bottom someone had printed, "Built by second chances." He placed the photograph beside her. "Every new employee hears your story during orientation." She blinked. "My story? I never mentioned your full name. I simply tell them someone believed in a frightened teenager before he believed in himself." He smiled. "And then I remind them to do the same for someone else." My mother's eyes shimmered. "I never imagined." "I know. That's why I wanted you to know." Before leaving, Victor turned toward me. "May I borrow your daughter for a minute?" My mother grinned. "She isn't 12 anymore." "I know. But I still need permission." She waved us toward the hallway. Outside, Victor became serious. "I have another favor to ask." "You've already done enough." "I disagree." He handed me a business card. "I've spent the last week reading about you." I frowned. "Reading about me? You've managed the same independent bookstore for years." "Yes, and I also learned you've organized free reading nights for children every Saturday." I nodded. "It isn't anything special." He smiled knowingly. "You sound exactly like your mother." I laughed. "I've heard that before." Our company foundation is opening community literacy centers in 12 cities next year. I stared at him. "We need someone who understands books. More importantly, we need someone who understands people." I looked down at the card. "I've never worked for a corporation." "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking whether you'd consider leading something bigger than one bookstore." I couldn't answer immediately. My entire career had been built one customer at a time. One recommendation. One conversation. Could I really do something larger? Victor seemed to read my hesitation. "Think about it. No pressure. Whatever you decide, your answer won't change what your mother means to me." He shook my hand, then quietly walked away. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked lighter, as though he had finally finished carrying something that had weighed on him for decades. I stood in the hallway for several minutes after he left. The business card felt unusually heavy in my hand. Not because it was made of expensive paper. Because it represented a future I had never allowed myself to imagine. For years, survival had been my biggest goal. Pay the rent. Keep the bookstore open. Make sure my mother had her medication. Repeat. Dreams slowly become smaller when life keeps handing you emergencies. When I walked back into the room, my mother noticed the card immediately. "He offered you a job." It wasn't a question. I smiled. "You always could read my face." "What kind of job?" I explained everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands in her lap. "You're afraid." "A little." "Why? What if I'm not qualified?" She tilted her head. "Maya, do you remember teaching 11-year-olds how to organize the summer reading festival?" I laughed. "They made me wear a volunteer badge that was twice my size." "And who ended up running the entire event?" "I did." "Do you remember organizing book drives after the floods?" "Yes." "And who coordinated nearly 400 volunteers?" I did. She smiled. You've been leading people for years. You simply never called it leadership. Those words stayed with me long after she fell asleep. Sometimes we confuse familiarity with limitation. Just because you've always lived inside one role doesn't mean it's the only role you're capable of filling. 2 weeks later, my mother was discharged. The hospital staff lined the hallway to say goodbye. Nurses hugged her. Doctors shook her hand. One orderly quietly slipped a handwritten note into her bag. Later at home, she opened it. It read, "Thank you for teaching my daughter to love reading 15 years ago. She graduates from medical school next month." My mother smiled and placed the note inside an old recipe book. No frame. No social media post. Just another quiet memory. 3 days after bringing her home, I met Victor again. This time, it was at the headquarters of Lang Industrial Foundation. The building was modern without feeling cold. Glass walls. Natural light. Shelves filled with books instead of awards. That surprised me. Victor noticed. I insisted. He smiled. Companies display trophies. I'd rather display ideas. He introduced me to department heads, program directors, and regional managers. No one treated me like charity. No one whispered that I was only there because of my mother. Instead, they asked practical questions. How would you encourage teenagers who say reading is boring? What makes a community library feel welcoming? How do you earn parents' trust? By the end of the afternoon, I realized something unexpected. They weren't interviewing me. They genuinely wanted my opinions. For the first time in years, people weren't asking what I lacked. They were asking what I knew. A week later, Victor called. "The position is yours if you want it." I looked around the tiny bookstore. The creaking wooden floors. The hand-painted children's reading corner. The little brass bell above the entrance. Leaving wouldn't be easy. I need one condition. Victor laughed. I was wondering when that would happen. The bookstore. I don't want it to disappear. It won't. I'd like the foundation to partner with it. Community events. Author visits. Free literacy programs. He smiled. I was hoping you'd suggest something exactly like that. Accepting the job changed my life more slowly than people expected. There wasn't an overnight transformation. I still woke up early. Still drank too much coffee. Still worried before important meetings. The difference was that my work reached farther. Within the first year, we helped establish 18 neighborhood reading centers. Nearly 12,000 children enrolled in weekend programs. More than 6,000 adults joined evening literacy classes. Every report I read reminded me of something my mother once said. Books don't change lives. People do. Books simply introduce them. Daniel heard about my new position 6 months later. I wasn't the one who told him. Our city wasn't large enough for news like that to stay quiet. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was leaving a literacy conference when I heard someone call my name. Maya. I turned around. There he was. He looked almost exactly the same. Same expensive coat. Same careful haircut. Same confident posture. Only his eyes seemed different. Less certain. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled awkwardly. You look well. I am. I'm glad. There was another silence. I heard about your mother. She's doing well. That's good. He shifted his weight. I also heard about your new job. I nodded. It's meaningful work. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I owe you an apology. I didn't answer. I was cruel. Yes, I can't change that. No, I've thought about that phone call almost every day. Rain tapped softly against the conference center windows. People walked past us without paying attention. No dramatic audience. No public humiliation. Just two people standing where their lives had quietly divided months earlier. I was wrong, he said. I measured people by what they could give me. I didn't understand what strength actually looked like. I listened. Nothing more. Nothing less. Finally he asked, "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I considered the question carefully. I stopped being angry a long time ago. Relief crossed his face. Then I continued. But forgiveness doesn't always rebuild trust. His smile faded, not because I'd been harsh, but because I'd been honest. I hope you build a good life, Daniel. I truly do. But it won't be with me. He nodded slowly. I understand. And for the first time since our marriage ended, there was nothing left to argue about. Sometimes the quietest goodbye is also the final one. He turned, walked into the rain, and disappeared into the crowd. I watched him for only a moment before heading toward my car. Not because he no longer mattered as a person, but because he no longer determined the direction of my life. Months passed so quietly that I almost didn't notice how different my life had become. The calendar filled with school visits, library openings, and community meetings, instead of overdue notices and collection calls. Every Monday morning, our team reviewed reports from literacy centers across the country. Some numbers stood out immediately. Others hid remarkable stories behind ordinary statistics. A 12-year-old who had read his first complete novel. A grandmother who learned to write her own letters instead of asking neighbors for help. A father who started reading bedtime stories after attending one of our evening classes. Success rarely arrived with fireworks. Most of the time, it arrived in the form of someone doing something they had never believed they could do. One Friday afternoon, I returned home to find my mother sitting on the front porch with a cup of tea. She looked healthier than she had in years. Color had returned to her face. She was reading a mystery novel with the same concentration she'd always had. Without looking up, she smiled. "You're late. There was traffic. There was probably another child who wanted to tell you about a book." I laughed. "Actually, it's 3. I knew it." She closed her novel and looked at me. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was difficult. Because no one had asked me in a very long time. I thought about it carefully before answering. "Yes." She nodded once. "I can see it." A few weeks later, Victor invited me to attend the Foundation's annual gathering. Nearly 500 employees, volunteers, teachers, and community leaders filled the auditorium. I assumed I would simply sit in the audience. Instead, Victor found me just before the program began. "I need a favor." I smiled. "I've learned to be careful whenever you say that." He laughed. "I want you on stage. I don't give speeches. You tell stories. There's a difference." "There isn't." Before I could argue further, the lights dimmed. The audience settled into silence. Victor walked onto the stage. For 20 minutes, he spoke about education, opportunity, and responsibility. Then he paused. When people ask how this foundation began, they usually expect me to talk about business. They expect balance sheets, investments, strategy. They're always disappointed. Soft laughter spread through the room. The truth is much simpler. It began with half a sandwich. The room became completely quiet. He told them about the library, about skipping school, about believing his future had already been decided, about one librarian who never asked why he was hungry before deciding to feed him. Not once did he exaggerate. Not once did he try to make the story sentimental. When he finished, he looked toward the front row. "Evelyn." My mother looked genuinely surprised. "Would you join me?" She slowly stood. The audience applauded politely, unaware of who she was. Victor helped her onto the stage. Then he stepped back. I've received many awards in my career. They're all in storage. The person standing beside me never received one. So tonight, he reached behind the podium and lifted a simple wooden plaque. No gold trim. No elaborate design. Just a single engraved sentence. For changing lives without asking for recognition. The applause grew louder. My mother accepted the plaque with both hands. She looked almost embarrassed. When the applause finally faded, she leaned toward the microphone. I don't really know what to say. A few people smiled. If you're waiting for wisdom. She glanced at Victor. I'm afraid he already used the good lines. Laughter echoed through the hall. She continued. When I worked at the library, I never imagined anyone would remember me. I certainly never imagined something like this. She looked across the audience. So I'll simply ask one thing. When you notice someone struggling, please don't spend too much time deciding whether they deserve kindness. Most people who need it have already convinced themselves they don't. She stepped away from the microphone. Nothing more. No dramatic ending. No rehearsed speech. Yet the entire audience stood. Not because she'd asked them to. Because they wanted to. I stood there clapping with everyone else, realizing something I should have understood years earlier. Recognition wasn't changing my mother. It was simply allowing the rest of us to finally see what had always been there. On the drive home, she placed the wooden plaque on the back seat. You know, she said, I'm not sure where to put that. I smiled. I thought you'd say that. It'll only collect dust. Probably. She looked out the window. I'd rather frame the note from that orderly. I know. We both laughed. That was her. Awards impressed other people. Handwritten gratitude meant everything to her. Sometimes people ask me which moment changed my life. Was it the phone call? The surgery? Meeting Victor? Getting the new job? The truth is, none of those moments existed on their own. They were connected by something much larger. For years, I believed life worked like a series of isolated events. A bad day. A lucky break. A chance meeting. Now I see it differently. Life behaves more like a river. Every quiet act flows forward long after the person who performed it has forgotten about it. My mother's extra sandwich traveled 26 years before finding its way back to her hospital room. Her belief in one frightened teenager eventually paid for the operation that saved her own life. Not because kindness is a transaction. It isn't. Most kindness is never repaid by the same person. But it changes the system people live inside. A world where one person chooses compassion becomes slightly easier for the next person to choose compassion too. And sometimes, without anyone planning it, that kindness finds its way home. If you're listening to my story, I'd love to know your answer to one question. Has someone ever changed your life through a small act they probably don't even remember? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you that quiet kindness can echo farther than we ever imagine, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.